and Dr. David McCoy served in the Army. He is currently, or after the Army, he was in 23 years in private practice. He is now at Veterans Hospital downtown Nashville in the post-deployment department. Dr. McCoy, the floor is yours.
I'm very grateful for Phillip and Esther. I'm excited about a project we're working on together called the Museum of the American Military Experience. And we have some of the display materials out in the foyer and some of the cards we'd love for you to take with you and get on the website and look at some of the things we're working on together to preserve our American military experience. And it's not just the stories from the veterans themselves, but it's also the experiences the families have gone through. And I'm excited about the opportunity to share some of those stories today. And also, a big project that we've had as a museum was In the Footsteps of Sergeant York, and we have some of those flyers out there. That display opened at the military branch of the State Museum downtown just yesterday. And we'll be here in Nashville with that In the Footsteps of Sergeant York for 6 months, and then it's going to go to the Pink Palace in Memphis. We hope to rotate it around the state, 2 or 3 more locations, and then take it on a national tour in hopes that it will end up in France in time for the centennial celebration of the American involvement in World War I by 2017. And that's exciting that we're getting to save and preserve some of that history for future generations. I wanted to share some tonight from the stories from my grandfathers and a few others. First, some background. As Phillip had sort of alluded to, I've been doing this for quite some time. I started collecting when I was 9 years old, and it started off with Civil War relics on Lookout Mountain, climbing up there with the Boy Scout troop. Got up there and there was a shoebox with these relics for sale, and I thought, man, this is really something. You can still get these mini balls. So I ended up with 4 mini balls. That was the start of this long, lifelong obsession. After collecting Civil War relics, I started when I was 9 with a metal detector, battlefields, campsites, chasing after the Civil War stuff all over the country. And also starting at 9 years old, every gift that I ever got for Christmas or birthday, it was always either a military artifact or something about the military. So the dream started building on itself. The first World War I relic I ever got was my grandfather's helmet. And his brother had made that into a lamp. That really upset my grandfather. It's not a lamp anymore, you can tell. He tore it all apart, told Clyde to leave his stuff alone. It was exciting. My grandfather's name was Claude Johnson. He didn't really have a middle name. He made one up occasionally. And it's kind of like the person doing genealogy research. It's like everyone's nightmare if they keep changing their name. Sometimes it was Claude without an E, and sometimes it was Claude with an E. And he used various middle names according to his mood at the moment. He was one of those that had lied about his age to get in the Army when he was 16. And he crossed state lines. It was from Dayton, Tennessee, and he went to Camp McClellan, Alabama, and enlisted there in the Army for World War I. It's interesting that my first book about World War I was this one right here, one of the Big Little books. This one's called The Great War Stories of World War I. I started getting finally off from Civil War relics and really collecting World War I, though, to an obsessive extreme like my wife could tell you, in about the first year of medical school. And I was in school here at Vanderbilt. I was on by this time, an Army Health Profession Scholarship program that they were sending me to school in exchange for year-for-year payback coming back into the Army. And it was an interesting time to be in the Army. We've talked about it and implied some of the issues where it's waxed and waned over the years. At that time, it was shortly after Vietnam, and definitely military service was on the wane. It was not nearly so popular. It was exciting today being downtown for the Veterans Parade, the 2 o'clock parade downtown. An amazing representation of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans coming back, and just an outpouring of attention. It's changed even in my lifetime from what it was after Vietnam to the way these fellows are getting received now. But I started collecting World War I during medical school because I met up with this veteran whose some of his artifacts are outside, and that's what those pieces that are displayed here right outside in the foyer. Mr. Eichenlaub was an Army nurse, and he was in 3rd Division, Rock of the Marne, in World War I. And it was fascinating because he was there some of their big battles when the Germans had tried to force the end of the war, and the Americans were really just in time as they were getting up to the Marne River crossings to try to defend them. The French were falling back and urging the Americans to fall back, that the end was near. And the 3rd Division wasn't going to fall back. It was the same with the Marine Corps in Belleau Wood, you know, retreat hell, we just got here. And the Americans have had a way of doing that over and over again in different settings. And Mr. Eichenlaub was right there with the 3rd Division, was Litterbear, and was clearing companies, clearing wounded there in that battle. That's his barracks bag out there. The blue bag is what a duffel bag looked like in World War I. That was his helmet that is out there too, with the 3rd Division insignia painted on it. And it was fascinating, the stories that he told me, one of the World War I veterans that I had gotten to know. His yard-long pictures out there. And it's a fascinating story, and we'll kind of come back to this theme over and over again. Who's going to save this if you all don't? And if you don't put it together and tell it to your children and tell it to their children, that it gets saved and passed along. And Mr. Eichenlaub, his son, after he had died, brought back all the letters that I had written to him and the letters he'd written to me, and gave me the correspondence to save with his material. And he called from Battle Creek, Michigan, and talked with my wife and said, we're passing through, we'll bring that yard long, and Dad's brassard, his diary, his medals, all the rest of his World War I mementos, we want to keep it together, will you take care of it? And it's like, yeah, I'm there. That's what I live for. And sure enough, brought the yard long and showed us which soldier in the picture was his father. And you know, you look at all those yard longs, all those pictures, World War I, World War II, and ever since that have been saved, you look at those groups of the soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen, those are somebody's kin. And who were they? And we don't know if someone hasn't passed along the story, but they called him Ike at the time. Ike's son told us about it and had us save that. The focus always, though, for me, wasn't about the artifacts, it was about the stories. And now I was really off on a binge after Mr. Eichenlaub and talking to him and the things he saw and did. My grandfather's stories had kind of gotten me started, and his were written. His nickname for me was Little Mike. My middle name's Michael. My grandfather's nickname I gave him was Big Mike, had nothing to do with his name, but he took it right in stride. And I've still got the correspondence, notes and things he sent back and forth to me. I still remember a few of the stories that he told me. He told me about sunny France, and it started raining right before the American involvement in Meuse-Argonne about the middle of September 1918, and it rained till after the armistice. It rained every day, to some degree, heavier, lighter, mixed with snow, but it rains off and on every day. He talked about sunny France and how it never was in his experience. And he told me about how he lost all the hair on his legs from the level of the knees down because the mustard gas was so ever present, and he didn't have the puttees off for 6 weeks. That being impregnated with the mustard, it was kind of like the perfect hair removal technique. So he never had hair on his legs below his knees. He finally died with complications of COPD in 1967 when I was 8 years old. But you know, the Camel cigarettes did a lot for that too. And it's neat to realize the legacy these folks, they could teach us all kinds of lessons. He had an ongoing argument with a French woman that my uncle had married, and my grandfather, till the day he died, understood and spoke French fluently after being in service in World War I. So he would argue with my aunt about how awful France was. And so that was always fun on the family get-togethers. My other grandfather, I got another grandfather when I was 9 years old when my first grandfather died. Within a year, from 1967, I met up with this man out hunting the war relics, Don Grove. And he took over. He was from Loudon, Tennessee. I grew up in Oak Ridge in East Tennessee. And Mr. Grove, and you know, it's funny, until the day he died, I never called him Don. I always called him Mr. Grove. It was a different time. And Mr. Grove, he took over from my grandfather, had been an Army First Sergeant in World War I. His photograph is out there, and the German belt buckle on a leather piece that he had carved. It's out there in the showcase on the right side of the foyer. He could do no wrong. This was a classic experience for me as a grandfather growing up, because by this time, you know, I was able to understand a whole lot more, 9, 10, 12 years old. But I never realized till I was in college he'd never been overseas in World War I. And in World War I especially, there was a pecking order. You were in service, you were overseas, you were in combat, you got wounded in combat, you got decorated for getting wounded in combat. So it was definitely that hierarchy. I didn't know that Mr. Grove, my grandfather, was on the bottom of their totem pole. But he was active in the American Legion. His American Legion book is out there too. His unit history, he was in an Army mechanic school that was at the University of Tennessee, Chihuahua Park. And it's fascinating. I looked at it again today, and yesterday as I was getting all this together. In that history, he has it inscribed, devotedly dedicated to the girl who is waiting for me from your soldier boy. And it has his wife's name that he did marry, Ori M. Collins. And then I had a testament of his. I was getting it out to put in the showcase, picking some pieces. There's a khaki testament right out there in the little showcase. But it was said to Don P. Grove from Agalee. Agalee, that's not Ori. And I thought, well, this must be another girlfriend of Mr. Grove's. And I'd always thought it. I'd seen it before. Getting it ready, I flipped it open, and in a penciled inscription on one of the next to the last pages in that Bible, it had this inscription, Dearest Don, take this little book as a lamp unto your feet and a guide to your pathway. Take the man Christ Jesus as your donkey. God bless and save and bring you home again, our precious soldier boy. Grandma Agalee. And so Agalee wasn't a girlfriend, that was his grandmother. And it's fascinating history like that is saved, because it's somewhere that people can put it together in context and realize it tells a story. His book, Inscription in American Legion, talks about one of his proudest achievements. He led Boy Scout troops from about the early 1930s all the way until the mid-1950s for the Tennessee Department of the American Legion. And that's Mr. Grove's legacy. People like me that were influenced by those values growing up. The relics are there too, though. I had some salty stories, some interesting characters I met, and one of the characters I met was a man named Walter Strickland, and it was fascinating. One time, this was after I was already in college at the time, and he was from Oliver Springs, close to home. He was a Distinguished Service Cross winner. I was thrilled to get to go talk with him and hear his stories and his version of events. And I went up, he was one time, it was in May, a little bit chilly out, he's wearing a jacket. He's sitting in a rocking chair waiting on the front porch of his house for me. Strickland and his squad, and just he couldn't get anybody to go because he thought it's going to be certain death if we crawl out of this trench line and these shell holes and start working around behind this machine gun nest. They're looking for the first one to get up. So he manages still to crawl out and get out of no man's land. And his big issue was, wouldn't you know, the first person in the patrol that comes out behind him is Pops. And he was real upset because Pops was this old man in their company. He was in his 30s. And he was sure, that's great, Pops is going to get killed any minute now. And Pops stayed right with him trying to cover for Walter while Walter was killing Germans and working behind this machine gun nest to take it out. But it's cool to realize afterward that comment was even in his Distinguished Service Cross citation, that he managed to take out that strong point without losing even Pops. Not even the loss of a man. The other story that he told me that was fascinating was as they were pinned down another strong point, another battle, they were pinned down completely on the ground. Those German machine guns were hitting typically 12 to 18 inches off the ground as they were laying down the cover and fire. So if you raised up into that window, they'd take your head off. And so they're all pinned down, facing the mud, and he's trying to turn over, roll over to get clear of it, to get clear of that field of fire that they can advance and take out this machine gun nest, and gets hit right in the right hip. And that machine gun bullet hit him like a baseball bat. He said, just right on the hip, and he immediately started feeling the liquid running down his leg. And he looked at, he could barely turn his head, that soldier, there's 2 or 3 of them lying there pinned down together. And he turned his head finally to him and said, so-and-so, so-and-so, look at my right hip and see how bad am I hit. And so in a few minutes the fire shifts and he manages to turn his head and look at Striplin's hip. And he says, oh, Striplin, you ain't been hit. You just, well, peed on yourself. But the word wasn't peed. And come to find out, the bullet had passed through the canteen and the cover, and when it hit the canteen, it felt like he'd been hit in the hip, and in fact, it just hit the canteen, and the fluid running down his leg was water from the canteen. So Walter Striplin did manage to, of course, survive the war. He was wounded on another occasion, and he just was another one of those people that lit my fire about trying to save this history. One of them was in my church growing up, in Robertsville Baptist Church in Oak Ridge in East Tennessee. I knew this man, McCoy Ward, that was a deacon in our church, and I just thought he was the greatest thing ever next to my grandfather's. Got to know him well. He'd been a squad leader in the Marine Corps. He was on Tarawa, and he told me some stories about what he had done in the Marine Corps. He was in the 3rd wave that landed on Tarawa when they were trying to take the beaches. It was early on in World War II. This is how they learned the hard lessons of what you could and couldn't do in island invasions. And Coy Ward had this exceedingly dry sense of humor. Just didn't get excited about anything. Now, Striplin got excited about everything. But Coy Ward was just, yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, this took place. And so I asked him, he said, I hear you got wounded. And he said, yeah, I got wounded. I asked him, well, how did that happen? Where were you? He said, I was in the 3rd wave that landed on Tarawa. The Japanese wiped out the first 2 waves in front of us. They had to come across, of course, the dead and dying Marines, the 3rd wave trying to get ashore. Coy said there was a pier that came out, and that gave them some cover and fire from the interlocking fields of fire the Japanese had set up with their machine gun fire. And he was able to work his way in along that pier with a bunch of other guys from the squad. And it was so funny. His big thing was, in his squad, they had a single-action Colt pistol that they took turns wearing. And it just so happened, on this particular day, Coy was the one that they let wear the single-action pistol. So Coy was convinced, this will save my life, you know, I've got the good luck. People were real superstitious about those things, you know. And it was fascinating. He got ashore. They were, finally, that 3rd wave took 70% casualties. The 30% of them got ashore, got through the dead and dying, started pushing the Japanese out machine gun nest by machine gun nest. And he said they were firing those light Nambus right on the beach, and they were flying stripper clips that as the stripper clip would run out before they could pop another one in, you could get up and rush forward about 10, 12 yards at a time to get a closer attack position on those machine gun nests. So they were trying to work their way up and around these nests. And he said the clip ran out, I jumped up and said I got hit right in the top of my shoulder. He said right across my chest, but there was all this wood blowing up. By this time they've got close shells firing support from the ships trying to get up, trying to save the invasion. And he said they're blowing up ammunition dumps, there's wood flying through the air. I just thought that it was a piece of that wood hit me. They took out that Japanese machine gun nest, and as he was advancing to the next one, decided, man, it's getting hard to breathe. And then one of the other guys looked and said, why, Coy, you've got blood running off the front of your chest. And it turned out that the machine gun bullet, he'd gotten up 1 instant too soon, and it hit him right above the nipple, went out the other side of his back, and dropped his lung. And because of that lung deflation, he couldn't breathe. And it was still amazing. Striplin would have been telling that story for hours. And Coy Ward is just, yeah, I got hit, it hit me right there. I was out for a while, I got better. And he was convinced it was because he was carrying that single action Colt. That was what saved his life, it was the luck of the Colt pistol. My father had been a Navy corpsman in World War II, and his jumper's out there, his ship's book, the Bountiful, is out there. It's his photo and the certificate right there with it. He was at D-Day on 7 different island invasions. And the story he told me that made such an impression, he was at Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Leyte, and Peleliu. And he said Peleliu was the worst. It was the worst. And his hospital ship, typically, as they would start hitting the beaches, the first wave, if they could get ashore, the hospital ship would come up right behind the first wave to start taking off the wounded. And they would be as close as they could get to shore without beach in the ship to try to get the shortest possible trip for the landing craft bringing the wounded off the beaches. And he said that you'd be up and you'd be seeing what was happening. Peleliu was the only battle where he saw Marines pushed off the shore, fighting in the surf, trying to save each other. And he said, I'll never forget that Marine officer shooting a .45 automatic pistol in water up to his waist, pushed off the shore. And those are things that you think, wow, what pieces of history. This last group that I wanted to talk about, though, is Hubert Hunt's. And Hubert Hunt's is right up here on the left. And that was a fascinating story. Where I grew up, my mother was from Dayton, Tennessee. And visiting my grandmother down there one time, she said, hey, this neighbor across the street has all this pile of stuff that she wanted to see if you'd be interested in to save it for your museum. So since I was 9 years old, this has been the plan. Someday I'll be part of a museum. And what it was Hubert Hunt's pieces. And my grandmother's friend said that they had taken in this older woman, didn't have any family at all. She had actually died. Going through her cedar chest, just a cedar closet, they found all these framed pieces. There's a bunch of them out there to look at. They found a Bible box, and they found a stationery box, his Purple Heart, and just some more correspondence, and would I be interested in it? And it's like, yeah, sure, absolutely. And what it ended up being, that was Hubert Hunt, who was in Battery D, 462nd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. What was there with his photographs and certificates, you can see him out there, his letters, and then the thing that was fascinating, it was the actual telegram that his mother had gotten, that we regret to inform you that your son has been killed in action. The telegram's out there. It's real short. And you think about how life-shattering, life-changing it is. And the rest of the story was fascinating too. Hubert Hunt was an adopted child. He was adopted from a family up here around Crossville. And he was an only child. They had raised him. When he died, she had no one. That's how she ended up there. And she had saved every letter he ever wrote home. He had mailed home from every paycheck they ever got, postal money orders with most of his paycheck getting returned to her. And on his body, when it was recovered, his wallet had all of those postal money order receipts still in it. And it had his Purple Heart, all of those frame pieces that she saved. She saved every piece of correspondence he had mailed home. That was in that stationery box that's out there. And it was fascinating. In that Bible box that's out there on the table has Jesus on the front of it. Those are the clothes that he came from the orphanage in when he had been adopted. Patches on patches on patches. And it's neat to look at that and that gold star that's out there, the gold star recognition, and to realize the price that had been paid by so many of these folks, and the price that his mother paid all those years, saving all of that stuff, and when she died, who's going to save the story? You know, where will it go? And then finally, I wanted to end it with just a modern day example, somebody that I'd run across with my work at the VA, working with the post-deployment. The sacrifice is still ongoing, and the patriotism and the values and the dedication, it's still ongoing. And I'd run across this fellow, his name is Patrick Brownfield. And his story, the first place it starts to get preserved is here on the front page article, Vanderbilt Hustler, of all things. This is the student newspaper from down at Vanderbilt. This is October 15th. Vanderbilt senior Patrick Brownfield served 3 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan as a U.S. Marine. And it's fascinating, the story that's in there telling about him. These are some excerpts from it. From 2007 to 2010, Brownfield served 3 7-month tours of duty in the infantry, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. There he was immersed in an extremely stressful, relentlessly dangerous environment. Imagine an 18-year-old kid walking 12 miles in 120-degree heat, carrying 80 pounds of gear, with the constant thought in his head, when am I going to step on an IED, or when is a sniper going to shoot me? Brownfield said, you have to stay in that mindset. If at any given time you let your guard down, that's when the bad stuff happens. We have a saying in the Marines, complacency kills. Born into a military family, Brownfield always knew he wanted to serve his country. I've always had the patriotism, that sense of duty, he said. One of the first things Brownfield did after he turned 18 was contact a recruiter, and he soon found himself deployed to Iraq, living among the populace and participating in counterinsurgency activity. For the first 4 or 5 months, it was completely surreal, he said. You got such a high, such a rush off to going into a firefight or catching bad guys. It wasn't until our unit got our first casualty that we realized that this is real life. This isn't Call of Duty, it's not Battlefield. And an example of that I had run across lately, it's a whole other area for preservation, for historical preservation part of the museum, was a Marine's tattoo that I'd seen as a patient just a couple weeks ago. They've got some remarkable art going into these tattoos now. And on this tattoo, right up here on his arm, it had that kind of classic comment about all gave some, and then it had 5 empty shell casings. And on each empty shell casing, it had a different Marine's name that had been killed in his unit. And his comrades, he decided to commemorate that. And it's all gave some, the 5 empty shell casings, some gave all, with those names. And he'll wear that the rest of his life. On the front lines of the war, Brownfield had to grow up quickly. He was quickly made a team leader, and by his 3rd tour, he had been promoted to section leader, making him responsible for the lives of between 13 and 15 other Marines. For me, I had the responsibility of kids' lives, Brownfield said, and I was still a kid myself. Brownfield had been initially driven to serve by his patriotism and was always motivated in part by his desire to protect his country. But as time went on, he found himself motivated by a different force. I thought, I'm doing this for the guy next to me, Brownfield said. It literally is a band of brothers. That's your biggest motivation, getting the guy next to you back home safely. And that's a quote that it brought to my mind from Goodbye Darkness, this memoir that William Manchester wrote about his experiences in the Marine Corps in World War II. Just a real brief little quote here. It was an act of love. Those men on the line were my family, my home. They were closer to me than I can say, closer than any friends had been or ever would be. They had never let me down, and I couldn't do it to them. I had to be with them, rather than let them die and me live with the knowledge that I might have saved them. Men I now knew do not fight for flag or country, for the Marine Corps, or glory, or any other abstraction. They fight for one another. Any man in combat who lacks comrades who will die for him or for whom he's willing to die is not a man at all. He is truly damned. And it's a fascinating thing how often that's the driving force getting through this day, this night, this issue where truly we're all in harm's way together. They do it for each other. And ask Brownfield, if he regretted any part of his military experience. Brownfield didn't hesitate. If I had it to do all over again, I'd do the exact same thing. And my last comments I would just make, these kind of attitudes and values and priorities don't just happen. It's not by happenstance. We need these vets. We need you vets. And we need your stories. We need an attitude of gratitude. We come from a long line of participants. But it'll only keep lasting as long as we keep producing people willing to lay their lives on the line for each other and for us and for the values that make us so distinctly different. The duty, honor, country motto from West Point fits, and yet it's rare all the time. We have to have the willingness and desire to give back, and that starts on the level in our schools and in our churches, and in things like the Boy Scouts, those value systems. And that's it. We're so excited that Forrest came along behind me and went and finished as an Eagle Scout just like I did, just like Mr. Grove wanted me to. It's imperative to pass on to our children and their children these values. And truly, to quote again the scripture, I will leave it with, greater love hath no man that he would lay down his life for his friends. And yet, back to that quote from Agalee in Mr. Grove's Testament, it's that type of love can only come from the God-man, Jesus Christ. And I'm just grateful to be a part of that. Thank you very much.